So we've blocked in most of the reds now, we've preserved the whites, still got a little bit to come back to here, but I'm just going to move on to the green. So I've got an olivey green here, and I'm going to start to, with a kind of very light to medium pressure, put it onto the stalk. So again, I've exposed the end, so I'm working with this kind of narrower, finer end. I just want to lay this down quite unfussily. And as I say, not going with really super hard pressure. Just going up to where those red areas are. And then along the stalk. And then the very tip of the stalk I'm going to do with my yellow ochre. So I'm just going to lay that in there. And I'm also going to add a little bit of shadow. So I'm going to start with my blue, because shadows are not black, they're a combination of colours. And I'm just going to lay a bit of grey over the top of that blue, just to add a little bit of definition. And then I'm going to lay some shadow in here too, just with the grey. Maybe here. Just add a little bit of texture in there. And then here I'm just going to carry that green along. And then I'm going to use my blender, but I'm going to give it a clean first because I've been working in red. So I want to make sure I get the red off of my blender. Just have a little play with these colours and see how well they blend together. What I was saying earlier about blending and things not always blending very smoothly, this is kind of a good example of it here. So when I'm using this blender, it's taking some of the green and it's kind of smoothing it into the background, almost lightening it. And then it's taking sort of darker areas, one of which I'm going to just pull out with my thumb now. And it almost creates a bit of a mess on top. It's like a sort of waxy mess, which is not very satisfying. So I'm going to try and take it off my paper. This just happens with certain pastels, I tend to find, and then you almost end up having to fight them on the page. So I might try a little bit of blending. And if you have got longer nails, you can always use your nail in one of these wipes just to play with your blending. And this doesn't have to look pristine, it's quite a kind of textural medium, so you don't have to worry about things looking really smooth. It's not the effect we're going for, but just sometimes you end up with things on your surface which are not very pleasing. So it's just a bit of an FYI really. So you can either work with that and almost make it a textural feature, or you can kind of play with different types of blending and see what happens. I'm just going to have a look for another green. So I've almost got this very sort of murky, khaki-ish green. So what I might want to do is almost come in from my shadow area with that green and then just pull it with a clean finger. And again, I'm getting a disturbance here, so let's try and blend it off. All you can really do when this happens is to just experiment a little and just try and encourage the pigment of the oil pastel to just sort of behave itself really. It's one of those creative struggles that we get into. It is a bit frustrating, but And don't let it put you off. It's just one of those things that happens. And I think sometimes with older sets of pastels, it can tend to happen too. So you can play with blending techniques. So I might want to use just a very light pressure over the top, just to kind of rein it in a bit really, and then play with my blending tool to just see what I can achieve. So it's not ideal, but it is a factor that creeps in sometimes when you work with oil pastels. Sometimes what you can do is to just actually use a solvent to blend it, but that's not the point of this exercise, so we kind of have to battle a little bit in this exercise. So what I can do is come back in with the original pastel, just use a bit of firmer pressure, and it's actually blending quite nicely now with those other colours. Sometimes you just find certain pastels will not blend together very smoothly, so it's just a question of playing and experimenting until you can get them to cooperate. So just a word of caution, if you've got a lovely brand spanking new set of pastels, you might even find that's not an issue, but if you have older sets like I do, it can become a bit of a factor. So I think for now that's pretty much behaving itself. So what we need to do is to just come down and finish off these pieces at the top here. So I'm going to lay a sort of a medium pressure kind of dotted effect, so I'm not going in over the whole of the surface of the paper. I'm kind of almost scumbling it, and that means that you're not kind of, you're using like a dotted pressure, you're leaving some of that surface to show through. And I might want to just add in some of that oranginess there, and do leave a little bit of the paper showing through in places as well. You don't have to cover everything. Now I'm going to come back down here and just add a little bit of the orange, and then use a bit of the red over the top. And again, that's quite a firm pressure. And it's fun to play with pressure as well, because then you can be more in charge and in control of where the light is shining on your subject. So you can play with kind of pressure and you know, maybe a bit of sgraffito, and there's all kinds of things that you can do. So I just need to finish these pieces here. So here I'm going to use a slightly less pressured stroke. And this is good as well for you to just kind of observe where some of the lighter and darker areas are. Even if you're just working from a photograph, it's just learning to read that information like we did in the charcoal exercise. And it's always good to kind of have that playful, kind of inquisitive approach when you're doing something like this. So you think, well, let's see what happens if, and then give it a try. Because at the end of the day, it's only materials and paper. It's not life or death. And the way that we learn is by taking risks. So if you want to variegate your tone a little bit more, you can. Maybe add a few little strokes of that orange in, just to liven things up a little bit. If you feel it needs it, go for it. There's no point having a blendable layered medium if you don't actually exploit the properties of it. So here I think that's possibly a little bit too light. So what I might want to do is to just take a clean area of my cloth and then just use that. And that way we don't have that really white exposed surface of the paper. We're just dragging the pigment across it. So we can see where we've left some of that white, but what we're doing is we're actually dragging the pigments across. So that's quite nice. And then what we want to do is to just add a little bit more shadow. So I'm actually going to go in with some of this olivey greeny colour, just to indicate where some of those shadow areas are. Now, I'm not using heavy pressure because of some of those issues we can have with blending darker colours over light. I'm just going in quite lightly and sort of almost playfully to see how it's going to respond. So far it's not too bad. Do need to just expose a bit more of end of this. So one thing about shadow is it is quite complex and it's not really a colour. So you can play with different colours such as purples or mauves or blues or greys. There's all kinds of colours that you can use to just indicate some of those darker tones and make your shadow areas look quite lively as well. And you can blend, don't forget you can blend. So if you're blending along the outline, follow the outline. And if you're blending up into the subject, and just blend upwards. Let's see if I've got any nice purpley colour. So I've got this colour here is quite nice, so I might want to just add a little bit of this just to kind of increase the darkness of that red tone, and because it's analogous, so it's similar in other words, it's just going to kind of darken that tone in a subtle way. So you can even vary the colours in your shadows in different parts of your drawing. The other thing you can do, and I've not tried this, I'm going to take a risk here which might backfire, you can actually drag it out so that it comes below your image. So we start to almost create the illusion that it's sitting on the surface of something. I'm using super light pressure here. I'm just almost tickling the paper underneath. And I'm using a combination of purple and olive. And I'm also going to add a little bit of this royal bluish colour as well. So this will give you a really interesting shadow colour because it's made up of lots of different pigments. So it almost creates like a complex shadow area. So if you wanted to add a shadow into your work, you could. And I just want to try and clean up some of my paper because it's picked up a lot of surface stuff. So it's always a bit of a gamble as to what you can get back off the paper. All depends what you've got on your hands and what your oil pastels are like. So I can just do that and then flick that off of there. So now what you want to do is just to kind of stand back from what you've created and just appraise it. Are you happy with where your light and your shadow is falling? Do you think it needs a little bit more shadow? If so, add a little bit more shadow. Like I'm doing here. What's interesting is as you kind of play with colours, you just give it a little bit more complexity. So it makes it quite interesting. it makes it sort of lively and interesting because it's got lots of composites that make up the whole. So rather than just seeing one tone, what we're getting is lots of visual interest from different things that have been added. So I quite like that, but I do think I need to kind of blend that red over the top. Just to create a little bit more of a transition. And I think in terms of the actual exercise, that's not looking too bad. Because we can see we've got shadow areas here. We've got a bit of texture at the top here, and I could even add a bit more by doing a little bit of sgraffito if I wanted. That will create a bit more texture, which is quite nice. There we go. We can just play with the edges and make sure that this is starting to look how we want it to look. So if there's any areas you're not happy with, now's the time to kind of decide where they are and what you want to do about that. Whether you want to do a bit more blending or add a little bit more colour. There's lots of techniques that we've looked at in this exercise. So we've looked at blending with finger, we've looked at blending with a shaper, we've looked at blending with a fairly dry baby wipe, we've looked at preserving the white, and we've looked at different ways of kind of blending the colour across and using the pigment to just kind of stretch it into those white areas. So what I have now on my composition, and actually what I'll do is I'll show you it more closely. What I have ended up with is defined areas. So we have shadow. So the light's kind of falling across more towards the top, and then towards the bottom there's more of an area of shadow, which we can see here in the shadow area that I've created. And then if you look close up, you can see those textured areas at the top, and then we've got the kind of preserved white areas, and then we have the very, very rich areas of pigment, and then we've got the shadow areas at the bottom. And when you kind of like look at it in the light, it's like I said earlier, you'll see that almost waxy finish that a pepper has, which makes it look quite convincing. And this is sort of where we come into like horses for courses really, which is choose the medium which suits your subject. So if I were to have done this in watercolour, I'm sure it would look lovely, but it wouldn't have that surface texture of a pepper. Whereas with the oil pastels, we can actually exploit their natural quality to make sure that we're recreating something and it looks very similar to the subject itself. So I hope you've learnt a little bit about oil pastel today and you've had a good play. If you've got any specific questions or concerns, do let me know and I'll try and assist you. But apart from that, I think I shall see you next time.